on the camera is a gentleman. His name is Robin T.W. Yuan. Chinese name is Yuan Wang, right? I think I can pronounce your Chinese name better than you.
Yes. 对.
Yeah, the reason he's here because he had this book written in 2021, right?
21 was published at the end of 2021.
Yeah, the title of the book, as you might can tell, Red Bishop. So bishop usually is more like a Catholic concept, right? It's like in Chinese, 主教.
Well, people might think it's Catholic, but bishops are present in many different religious sects. So this is actually the Church of England or Anglican Church. In the United States, it's the Episcopal Church.
Yeah, it's 中文叫圣公会, right? It used to be called 中华圣公会.
Correct. And translated, as I understand, it's Holy Catholic Church, but it's the Protestant Church, not the Vatican Catholic Church.
Yeah, 不是罗马天主教，是一个英国的国教，是吧？更像。I know. So red bishop means like 红色的主教. So who is this man? That must be the red bishop, right?
Well, that photo is of my maternal grandfather, who is the subject of the book. The book is called Red Bishop because he is not the Red Bishop. He is the Red Bishop in the book, but many bishops in the Anglican Church during the time that the communists took over were referred to as Red Bishops.
I see.
So he's not the only one that was referred that name.
Mm-hmm.
And there are actually three different meanings to this title, which if you read the book, you'll understand the three different meanings.
Let me guess. One is Communist China, right? That's usually the red color refers to the revolution.
Yes, that's the obvious title, but It's not the most important.
Yeah, so the second will be?
The second is you can see on the Chinese character on the book is Xiang, which is the, in Chinese chess, there is a black and red side, and the Xiang is the bishop. It moves just like the bishop.
Oh, yeah. Let me show it to the audience. So this character, Xiang, right, is more like you said, prime minister.
Or some
bishop.
people translate it as bishop. And I use that as a metaphor because in the Chinese chess, as opposed to the American chess, this piece is more of a defensive piece because it can't cross that blank space in the middle called the river.
Yeah.
And that was very much the idea of my grandfather who decided to stay in China and not move to the United States after the communists took over. And that then refers to the real reason of the red bishop is that red has always been a good color in Chinese history. It means good fortune, happiness, prosperity. And that reference to China is the meaning of red bishop. That is, he was a patriot. He was a Chinese bishop. And that is more of his legacy, not so much that he became more communist-leaning towards the end, but that he was a patriot.
He loved his people and he loved the land, maybe. He loved the culture, too.
Yes, he was very much trying to help the Chinese people who he saw from a very early age were suffering, the poverty, the sickness, the lack of education.
Right.
And he tried to help the people, and the Christian religion and the church was his method of helping Chinese people.
So was he always a Christian or?
No, he grew up in a Confucian family like most Christians were originally and was converted. His father had the foresight, and which a lot of Chinese families had at the time in the late 1800s, early 1900s, to teach their children English. And the mission schools were the best schools to learn English. So he sent his son, my grandfather, to St. James Mission School in Wuhu, specifically to learn English.
It's in Anhui Province,
In
right?
Anhui Province.
Wuhu?
Wuhu, yes, on the Yangtze River. And during the time that he was a student there, he began to understand the Christian principles and eventually converted to Christianity and was baptized.
Then he kept his faith all in the rest of his life.
Yes, it was a faith that was based, I think, a lot on his patriotism because, as I described in the book, after the communists took over, he was torn between the loyalties to the church and the expected loyalties to the Communist Party. And I talk about how he resolved that.
Yeah, because the church, like Anglican Church in China, was dissoluted, right, after maybe 1949.
When the communists took over in 1949, there was an organization among Chinese Christian leaders and the government to form this Three Self movement.
Right, 三自教会.
Yes. So my grandfather was asked to sign what was a Christian manifesto that was constructed by Zhou Enlai and Y.T. Wu. And he refused to sign that. And eventually the Three Self Movement Church became the prominent government-sanctioned church, and the Anglican Church basically faded away because the Three Self Movement Church was non-denominational. So the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Congregationalists, all the non-Catholic Protestant denominations came under one roof in the Three Self Movement.
Let's talk about the cover. So I noticed there's a lady. I guess that's your mother, right?
Correct.
So you wrote this book for what kind of reason? I bet must be personal reason, family reason, and what exactly?
Yeah, so the book was an adaptation of a screenplay. My original concept was to develop a movie based on the life of my grandfather, who after I did a lot of research, realized that he was a central figure not only in the church but in China's history in the 20th century. And I thought that his life would be a good vehicle to tell the story of 20th century China. But of course, I was always interested in how I ended up in Boston, going to great universities, when I knew that my family came from a very humble Christian religious background, and from a country that I thought was one of the most interesting and unknown countries of the 20th century, that had a whole host of problems. And then finally, when the communists took over, the idea of having a bishop in a communist country was very intriguing. So this whole family story worked very well to tell the story of 20th century China.
Actually, your family history is really unique and rare, right?
Well, I think, I don't know how unique it was in the sense of there are many Christians who grew up, were converted in mission schools and went to good mission colleges and then came to the United States and made a good life here and had children like me. So that is not that rare, but I think the important thing was that my grandfather, my mother's father, was this figure in the Christian church, and that the Christian church had a role to play in China's history,
right?
From the early 1900s all the way through the Cultural Revolution and even today's China.
I read a few chapters of your book, so I assume this character called Jian Chen is your grandfather, right?
Yes.
And he goes to a private school, a Christian school, and his father tries to let him study more English, so in order to get a better social status. That does it mean your family, in the grandfather family, was relatively wealthy?
No, actually, well, The story about my grandfather's father was that he never passed the imperial exams. And even though his father was an administrator of the Temple of Confucian, so his
You mean 孔庙, right? It's just
yes.
in Shandong.
I don't know exactly where it was, but they were in the Anhui province. But within the state examination system, his father was his grandfather was an administrator. So it was a little bit disheartening that the Jian father didn't pass the exam, and he had sort of odd jobs, enough to provide for the family. But I think that from my interpretation, there was an understanding and realization that in order to get ahead in that society in China, which was becoming more dominated by the Western world, that to speak English would be an advantage.
Right. Those mission schools, I think, maybe planted some seeds for his later fate, right? And then, like you mentioned, he stayed in China throughout those turbulence, those history events later on. But when did your family got out of China, and how did you end up here in the United States?
You have to read the whole book because it's a long story. But
so you put yourself into the novel too? Or?
Yes, I'm the character. My character in the book is Didi, which is my Didi, which
right.
is my
little brother.
Nickname. Yes, that was my nickname that everyone called me. So Didi in the book is me. But I have a very small part in the book. It's really not about me, and I didn't want it to be about me. But the Red Bishop Tianzhen, the Tianzhen is a name that he adopted when he was baptized. He had a different interpretation of the Chinese character Jianzhen, but so he chose Jianzhen, see the truth, as his sort of Christian
or
name.
见证 means like testimonial, like
Jian,
witness.
Jian, see,
健康
see, to see.
见 see, right?
Jian,
Yeah.
and 真的
Jian prove, right?
Truth.
Truth. 见真 right?
Yes.
It's like seeing truth.
Seeing
truth.
truth.
I got it.
Right.
I got it.
Yeah, so that's what he adopted that name when he was baptized. And he eventually had given me my Chinese name, which is Zhu Wang, which is interpreted as hope of the ancestors.
Yeah.
So I had a very sort of emotional, close connection with him, even though I never met him. But he found a love for the church, which became a sanctuary in his community when he went to the mission school. And as I say, eventually became baptized and went on to Boone College and Divinity School, and eventually became a minister in the Anglican Church. He did come to the United States twice. Once was between 1929 and 1932 when he was studying in Ohio and the University of Pennsylvania. He eventually got a master's degree in sociology from the University of Pennsylvania. And then in 1946 and 47, he came back to the United States to try to find assistance, financial aid to help rebuild the church, which was decimated during the World War II and the Japanese occupation.
Oh, okay. I see.
So those are the two times that he came to the United States. He went back to China, eventually became the presiding bishop when Mao took over. He was invited to leave China by Chiang Kai-shek and also by the American Church. They encouraged him to leave when the communists were about to take over Shanghai, and he refused. Just like I said, the Red Bishop in Chinese chess, he was loyal to his country. My mother had come to United States after graduating from Jingling College.
Jingling,
Yes,
Nanjing,
yes. And she went to University of Pennsylvania to study medicine.
When was that? How old was she?
She was probably 24. She was born in 1923. And she came in 1947.
I see.
So she came to University of Pennsylvania Medical School to become a doctor and was expected to go back to China to help serve the people and become a doctor there, but then the communists took over. So then she was more or less trapped in the United States, had gotten married, had 3 children, including myself, and didn't feel like she could go back. And so she didn't go back until 1975.
Wow. Seems like I sometimes go here and there, but you just mentioned your mother, Grace, right? That's her name.
Correct, yes.
And in Chinese, it means India, right? It's a pretty Christian name. It's the free gift of God, right? It's the mercy of God. Right. Then she was a doctor. Then now you have been a doctor for many years, right?
I still am a doctor, yes.
Right. From what I know, a plastic surgeon?
Correct.
How did you get involved to this?
Well, I went to Harvard Medical School, and during the 3rd year, we're allowed to take elective courses. And at that time, I knew nothing about plastic surgery. I didn't know what it was. So I decided to take an elective in plastic surgery. And this was at the Peter Brigham Hospital and Boston Children's Hospital for 2 weeks. And my mentor or professor at the time was Dr. Joseph Murray. He was world famous for many things, one of which was he did the first human kidney transplant in 1954, and he was a pioneer in craniofacial surgery to rearrange faces and skulls of kids born with deformities. So during this time that I was with him, I realized that plastic surgeons thought very differently. Their approach to surgery was very creative. So sometimes they would have a problem that didn't have any known solution, and you would have to figure out a solution. Whereas most other specialties, you learn how to do an operation. So you learn how to do a gallbladder operation. You learn how to do an appendix. And it's just A, B, C, D, depending on the technique. So I found that plastic surgery was much more free-thinking and creative.
And let's go back to your grandfather. So I noticed there's many chapters in your book. It's like 71 chapters, and lots of those name of the chapter actually it's pretty Christian, right? For example, chapter 36, "The Lord is my shepherd," is I think is extracted from very famous Psalm 23. Right. How you yourself is not a traditional Christian from what I know, right? You're not a believer, right?
Well, it's always evolving, but I grew up as a Christian, went to Sunday school, was baptized and confirmed, and brought my children to church.
That's your mother's influence, I assume.
Well, both my mother and my father. Both my parents were very devout Christians. In the book, I explained that while my mother's father was the last presiding bishop of the Anglican Church, my father's grandfather was the first Chinese consecrated bishop in the Anglican Church.
Oh, so your mother and father has similar family history, though, right?
My lineage is from bishops, so it was very ingrained in our family. We really didn't think very much of it. It was just like learning English.
What happened to you?
Well, I think I'm not an evangelical type of Christian. I do accept and adopt many of the Christian principles. I think that's more important rather than believing if you could someone turn water into wine type of story.
Miracle, huh? Miraculous
right?
stories.
Because I'm a scientist and a doctor, so those two aspects of religion and science kind of rattle around in my brain. So it's
I understand that.
Yeah. But I think the Christian principles are very strong and very adaptable to human life and humanity, and so I think that's the most important aspect of Christianity for me.
Yeah.
So yeah, I may not go to church every Sunday, but I go to Easter Sunday and Christmas and try to bring my kids to just keep them in the fold, so to speak.
The reason I ask is because you have to virtually go into your grandfather's soul to look at the situation and the environment surrounding him, right? And make those fictitious part actually out of some kind of authenticity, right? So that's why I asked. So
Yes.
you must have understand why and how this faith played a huge part in his life.
Yes, I mean, I think there's a little bit of me in the story, obviously, because I looked at it from my life, where I came from, what my lineage is, and that I was writing the story. But it's more a view of my grandfather's point of view, as well as other characters. I tried to understand what motivated him, what principles of life he was living by, and many of the events in the book are well researched, as I point out in the bibliography. They're scenes that are described firsthand. So, but I obviously wanted to dramatize it and make it more interesting. So there is a fictionalization of the real life events, and certain scenes, like you were referring to, the Lord is my shepherd, where my grandfather is walking back to Wuhu. He actually did that. He walked 5 days, 6 days to get back to a meeting.
That's his Death Valley. That's,
Yes. Yeah, when he was
Valley of Death.
Yeah, when he was reciting the Lord's Shepherd, and it started to rain, and so I try to fit that scene in with the Lord's Prayer as he was meeting Japanese troops, and just try to dramatize the fact that his faith got him through that perhaps terrifying time in order for him to reach the destination of Wuhu.
Yeah, speaking of those later on 3 self-church, you said your grandfather didn't comply with the doctrine, or what happened? Then what's the consequence of his in his real life?
Right. So he was elected presiding bishop of the Anglican Church.
Yeah.
And so that's the position he held in 1949 when the communists took over. Y.T. Wu was a secretary of the YMCA. He himself was not a clergy, but he was very influential, believed in sort of the social value of Christianity. And he, along with 40 other Christian leaders, not including my grandfather, went to Zhou Enlai, and that group, along with Zhou Enlai, developed what was known as the Christian Manifesto, which basically condemns certain things that communists condemn, such as capitalism, imperialism, bureaucratic feudalism, but they also specifically condemned American imperialism, as you might think the Communist Party would do.
Yeah, it's called 美帝国主义.
Maybe it could be.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't speak Chinese, but
Go ahead.
and also pledged allegiance to the Communist Party. So they brought this manifesto to my grandfather to sign, since he was the head of the Anglican Church, and the idea was to have all the Christians sign this manifesto, which would essentially bring the Christian community on the side of the government. And he refused to do that, mainly because, as I understand it, he didn't know really what the Communist Party was going to do with organized religion, with Christians. He was still a little bit uncertain as to what was going to happen, and so he didn't want to endorse it, especially when his life was benefited by Americans. He sent his kids to American schools. He was brought up in missionary schools. He knew that.
Yeah, he probably was very fluent in English, right?
Yes, he received a honorary degree from the University of Pennsylvania in 1938, and one of the citations was that he was an expert in an Occidental language that wasn't his native language. So he was a very good and dynamic speaker. But anyways, he didn't sign the manifesto. They came to him 3 times, and he refused. And so he was called to Beijing, and I describe a scene between Zhou Enlai and my grandfather. And
Did they actually met?
Yes, from what I understand, he was called to Beijing because they wanted him to sign. And as far as I know, there are no records of what was actually said. But so I created this dialogue because I knew the end result was that he eventually signed.
Oh, he eventually signed.
And he was convinced to sign. And my thinking was that he saw that the Communist Party was really trying to help the country, and that they weren't going to get rid of the church, and they actually wanted the Christians in their fold to help them rebuild the country. And so he had a good feeling about what was coming, and also probably felt that if he didn't agree, that bad things were going to happen, right?
Yeah, that's for sure.
And there is a report of the FBI report when my mother was investigated in the early 1950s, where the FBI had talked to some bishops and were inquiring about my grandfather. And there were things that he did that they questioned, and the bishops felt that, well, he was probably forced to do certain things, and that he wanted the best for China, and he wanted, obviously, the church to survive and Christianity to survive. So he put all these things together and eventually supported the Three Self Movement Church and became one of its leaders.
And did he ever regret that decision in his life?
I don't think so, because until the very end, even when he was persecuted during the Cultural Revolution, he went through the typical public denunciations, parading through the streets, had belongings burnt. My relatives, when I spoke to them about this time, and they actually lived with him during this difficult period, told me that he was always a patriot to the end, and he in fact told them to believe in Mao. And so they felt that by this time, this is almost 20 years since he became a bishop, that he had essentially believed that the Communist Party was helping the Chinese people, and that Mao, despite all of his
evil doing,
his mistakes, which he also acknowledged since he stepped down as head of state after the Great Leap Forward problem, that my grandfather still believed in Mao and the Communist Party to make China prosperous and successful.
But that's a contradictory thing. So he never left China again, right? Because you mentioned he been to United States twice, in the 21st and the 32. But did your mother ever going back when he arrived in the United States?
No, so my mother came to the United States in 1947. Her father was here trying to gain support. He eventually went back, obviously, and my mother stayed and became a doctor, got her medical degree at the University of Pennsylvania. And she was caught in this never land that a lot of Chinese students were caught in because they were students expecting to go back, but then the communists took over.
But your grandfather think Mao did good things. Why didn't he just call her coming back home?
He did that all the time. So my mother had letters that she saved, about 400 letters from both my grandfather and grandmother and other relatives. And in these letters, my grandmother would talk about family matters, who was married to whom, who had kids, how the family was doing.
Yeah.
And my grandfather would talk about the country, how the country was improving, how the church was growing, how the people were happy. And he would always say, come back. When are you coming back? You need to come back to serve the people. Your destiny is not in the United States or with Russia, it's with China. And so she had this burden put on her by her father and to go back to China and use her medical knowledge and education. Unfortunately, during this time, she got married and had 3 children, so her family was in the United States. And she was very torn, I believe. And I only really understood this as I was writing the book, that a lot of things that happened to her that I witnessed as she was growing older didn't really make sense. But then I realized, she was probably traumatized by the separation from her family and especially her father. I think she felt very unfulfilled and disappointment to her father because she ended up not doing the thing that she knew that he wanted her to do.
What he wanted her
he wanted her to go back to China and to be a doctor in China. And she, you have to remember that at the time there were very few Western trained doctors and very few women, and she was already relatively well known in certain circles. She was the president, her class president at Jingling, which is a very prominent women's Christian college. She was sent to India to represent Chinese college students at the celebration of India's independence and met President Nero. So she was looked at, especially by my father, as potentially a leader of China. So when she didn't go back and didn't fulfill this wish of his, I think she knew that she was a disappointment, and I think that played a lot in her behavior in her later life and her essentially sadness, I think, and sometimes anger.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. But when your mother first came to United States, did the Episcopal Church help her, or did he get any help?
Yeah, she actually got a lot of help. Scholarships from different church groups like women auxiliaries, and also her father, my grandfather, had many connections because of his previous trips and because of his connection with the Episcopal Church. He knew a lot of the administrators and ministers and bishops within the church. So there was this community and network that helped her. In fact, she met my father through a Episcopal minister in Philadelphia who was a friend of my grandfather from the 1930s.
Yeah, it seems like the 2 generations enjoy their own life in different places. But how did your grandfather did after the Cultural Revolution?
Well, during the Cultural Revolution, as I mentioned, he was persecuted.
Right, that's normal.
Right, normal. And he was in that class of Chinese citizens that were denied medical care. I think President Liu Shaoqi was in the same boat. And so they weren't treated for certain medical problems, and he had long-standing history of gastrointestinal problems, including bleeding. So there were a number of incidences where he ended up in the hospital, needed transfusions, needed operations. But during the Cultural Revolution, he was refused medical treatment and ended up, he was put under house arrest and then died under house arrest because he couldn't get medical treatment for his stomach, bleeding stomach.
Oh, so he didn't survive the Cultural Revolution at all.
Right. He died in 1969, which is sort of in the middle. It was after sort of the very intense part of the Cultural Revolution, but a lot of that rebellious attitude was still around. So he died in 1969. The Cultural Revolution didn't end until 1976.
How did you write that part of your grandfather's story in this history fiction then?
Right. So it's a dramatization of events that I knew took place, mainly from conversations with my family and a memoir from my aunt, Aunt Hui, who is in the book. She's one of the main characters, was my mother's younger sister. And she eventually wrote a memoir, unpublished, sort of informal, which I read. And she described what happened to my grandfather, the different episodes of bleeding. My mother actually had some transcriptions of reports, and they would say exactly how many cc's of transfusions he would need, that he needed a splenectomy and ligation of varices. So there were very specific, truthful statements that were firsthand or translations of firsthand knowledge. So I used that as a springboard to develop sort of a dramatized impression of what was happening at that time. For instance, one of the scenes was of my grandfather being refused treatment at a medical clinic, and that was almost directly from what my aunt had written, and that he needed medication and injections, and they refused to give him that.
That's more like sounds external condition of him, but did you put any words for just describing how his inner reaction or emotion or even, I don't know, spiritual thoughts about the later life of himself?
Some of the dialogue obviously were imagined in my head, but some of it is actually verbatim from reports, newspaper interviews, or speeches that I lifted from one scene and put it in as dialogue in the book. So I tried to get in his head in terms of what he was believing, what was happening, and how he would react. And so obviously that's why it's a historical fiction and it's not a true biography.
But what's your personal feeling about his life? Do you feel he chose the right path, or how? I don't know. I'm not judging. I just it's such a complex thing, right? History just happened to people, but he made that decision, which I think hugely impact his family and his own. Or maybe today we still can reflect upon what exactly is the most valuable thing, or what's the truth. What is personally?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned in presentations and in the book, that there are certain events that are beyond our power to overcome or to change, and those are the things that we have to react to and to make decisions about, and that's normal for any person. You don't have to be a bishop to have that, but things are put on our way and we have to make decisions. whether or not they're right or wrong depends on where you stand and what your beliefs are. So I'm not sure if there's any right or wrong. I think one of the bigger pictures in this story is that, like a lot of things in China's history, there's tragedy, from famine and floods and wars and conflicts and civil, strife. And what is the meaning of that? What is the end result? And what I wanted to show is that there's some hope. My name is Hope to Wang. And so out of all these both national and family tragedies, there is hope. And the hope from his point of view is that the Chinese church is alive, that the Three Self movement, which was completely shut down, the churches were closed, none of the Christians were openly worshiping during the Cultural Revolution, that all was revived. In 1979, when Deng Xiaoping came into power, churches were reopened. The Three Self movement was reorganized, rose from the ashes, and there was a memorial given to my grandfather 10 years after his death. And I visited the Three Self movement offices about 5 years ago and asked them the state of the church. And at that time, they reported that there were about 38 million Christians, registered Christians, within the Three Self movement government-sanctioned church. But there were probably even more believers in the so-called underground churches or house churches.
Family church.
Yes, that were not part of the government-sanctioned church. And now those churches had a difficult time because the government tried to shut many of them down. But the point was that out of the ashes of the Cultural Revolution, partly because of the faith of my grandfather and his persistence, the church is still alive and growing. In fact, there is a projection that China in a few years will be the most Christian nation in the world because of its population. And then from my mother, her tragedies and difficulties and sadness because of the separation from her family and the disappointment of her father's dream for her. The last chapter in the book is my bringing my two young children to her gravesite and trying to explain how she helped support China and Chinese people. She would open up her home. She and my father would open up their home to visiting students, to doctors, to even bishops, scientists, professors, and host them during the time that after Nixon opened up China, they would come to visit the United States. So in some way, she helped rebuild China too. So that idea of hope coming from tragedy is an important part of the message of the book.
Yeah, hope. Like you mentioned, you 中文名 right 主望. So ancestors' hope. But how did you describe this hope, like in a more abstract way?
Yeah, just in terms of what the outcome of this, that is the church has survived. The whole idea from the very beginning of the book was to establish a native Chinese church from a foreign-run Western church, and that was a success. In 1956, all the bishops were Chinese.
So you mean like Three Self church status now, because it seems proper. There are lots of people are going to Three Self church.
Right.
So you think that's the hope kind of like maintained very, very well?
Well, if you think about that, the communist government could have in 1949 just gotten rid of the church, right? That it's professed to be an atheist party, even though there is a provision for freedom of religious belief in their constitution, original constitution. The Communist Party is known to be atheist. So you could make a case that there shouldn't be any Christians. There shouldn't be any church. There shouldn't be any.
I think they did it for political reasons. Like you said, they need allies, and they need to win people over gradually. They cannot just kill them all, abolish all those institutions. Then this new China probably cannot even be built.
Well,
right?
That's absolutely right. And that's one of the points I make when I give talks is that there's a pragmatism to the approach that the communist government has. At that time, they wanted Christians to be part of the rebuilding of China because they were educated. They were very patriotic.
That's true.
They had built churches and built medical clinics, built hospitals, built schools.
Yeah.
So they were a very positive force that I think Zhou Enlai and the party leaders wanted to have on their side.
But my problem with that is like they only focus on pragmatic things. Then now, see, China is rising, right? But I think lots of things has to sink to the West somehow. Like when the world opened up for China to join the WTO and such things like that. But when they built a country like this, so advanced, so modern, but still they afraid of like open up to give people the freedom to choose, to have some real faith. Because I mean, Three Self Church is not really like a free-thinking religion, right? They kind of censored lots of things, and people have to praise the party in the church. That sounds like a little ridiculous somehow.
Yeah, I think it depends on your perspective and your interpretation of things. Certainly, there is a criticism of China and the church. In fact, in 1956, I described this scene at the Washington Cathedral where Hollington Tong, who was the ambassador from the Republic of China to the United States, gave the speech and called my grandfather and YTU godless agents of communism. And so, and that's where some of the Red Bishop nickname was disparaging, was a disparaging nickname given by the Western bishops. So they called them Red Bishops. So there obviously is a point of view that the Christians and the Christian leaders now are not real Christians, that they're under the thumb of the Communist Party. I'm not sure.
I'm not sure too, because who can judge that?
Yeah.
But people do judge by their, like, sometimes it's just political choices, right? But I disagree with that. I mean, we have to regard human as humans. And I somehow sympathize with their choices because it's not a good choice after all.
Well, yeah, I mean, you put it, and that's part of the drama of this is that ordinary people are put in this untenable situation. And that also occurred, I described in the book, this denunciation session where my grandfather was forced to denounce another bishop. A friend of his. And many people were put in that situation. During the Cultural Revolution, children were denouncing their parents.
Is that Xiao Wang? No? Not his friend from childhood.
No,
right?
Xiao Wang is a childhood friend who became a doctor and was one of the doctors who refused to treat him.
I see. Really?
Yeah.
That dramatizing.
Yes. And there's another character in the book who my grandfather helped when he was woohoo, and he ended up helping my grandfather when he was refused medical treatment. So this sort of dichotomy of friends from childhood, one of which helped him and one of which couldn't. So, there's no right or wrong. Everybody makes a choice. But the point, what was I going to say about the church is that It's a very complex problem, but I think my grandfather made a pragmatic choice that eventually he believed in, and that was that he had to support the government. It almost didn't matter which government it was. It could be Kuomintang, it could be whoever.
You think he will support whichever governed
I think you have to remember the history, which I tried to describe, in that by 1949, there were 50, 60 years of strife.
Right.
The Box Rebellion, the Qing Dynasty falling, the warlord period, the World War I, World War II, Japanese invasion twice, all these things happening, famine and floods and pestilence and all sorts of, natural disasters. And everybody just wanted peace. Everybody just wanted order. And it didn't matter who was in power to some people. Yes, they chose Kuomintang versus communists or vice versa. But I think people were just tired of all this chaos. And so his accepting the government's role in the church was part of that, sort of those pressures brought upon him to make peace and to try to rebuild the country. And that was really foremost in his mind and a lot of people's mind. Remember, there were Chinese citizens who came back to China from the United States or elsewhere to help rebuild the country.
Yeah, many of those, though, end up not very well, though. But some of them, sure, they contribute a lot and they got praised. And some of them even became superstars. It's like scientists, right, who built the A-bombs, people like that.
My father, on the one hand, a lot of his classmates, which were from St. John's, the premier missionary.
That's very famous. That's Shanghai, right? St. John's University.
Right. So
St. Yuan 大学.
Right. So he was the president of both the college class as well as his medical school class. And so a lot of those doctors ended up in the United States, and my father helped them find jobs. But the ones who stayed behind became chiefs of department, became, world famous for, doing microsurgery. So, there was this brain drain, but the people who got left behind or went back, as you said, became superstars. So they were very needed because they were very, very rare, it's an interesting dilemma that a lot of people had to face, and in terms of where their loyalties, lay.
Maybe it's not even loyalty. It's about a man's real feeling about what's more important, right? We don't even know your grandfather. I do believe probably he still have a really good relationship with God, right? He probably think, what I've done, I need sacrifice. Like maybe people will judge me like I'm like helping a communist regime, but in order to help people, right, to save souls, maybe I will swallow this pride. I would just, maybe it's not even a bad name for me, but I will do what I think is right. I don't know, right? Who knows, right?
Well, there is a scene in the book where somebody asks him about what he believes in, if he's pro-communist, whatnot, and he simply says, I do the work of Jesus, but I do it in China. And throughout the book and the story, I had this impression that he was very, Christ-like, that he was very pure, very idealistic, very devoted to the church, would give away what money he had to allow children to go to school. Mm-hmm. So he was very much a hero in the real sense. And I think that drove him a lot. Obviously, when he refused to leave China, even though both a general from Chiang Kai-shek's army came to tell him to leave. And
he probably had several chances.
Yes,
right?
He had several chances. But as I say in the book, before those people came to him to offer safe passage out of Shanghai, Zhou Enlai had come to him and asked him to stay.
Yeah, that Zhou Enlai was a very charming politician.
Yes.
He did make lots of people stay, but he couldn't protect them in the end. And but I mean, that's huge.
Well, a lot of these characters in the Communist Party were victims of
their
own beliefs or society, what was happening with the Red Guards. I mean, they got out of hand. And
then in your perspective, who murders your grandfather? Who murdered them? And what kind of ideas? I do think it's like I hate any kind of rigid ideologies, right? So I do think communism is a ideology which kills, right? We saw that in the past century. It murdered mass murder lots of people. But your father, who murdered your grandfather, you think?
I wouldn't say murder. I think he was a victim of certain circumstances, again, beyond perhaps individuals' control. For instance,
that's for sure.
Yeah,
the
idea, and I don't know if this is exactly how it played out, but I heard stories that he went to the hospital with a bleeding ulcer, and people that he knew refused to treat him during the Cultural Revolution, so he was turned away, and he was treated poorly. And then, so he went home, and then when he bled another time, he decided not to go to the hospital. He sort of gave up.
He accepted his fate.
He accepted his fate. He knew that he was in this undesirable class.
He was rejected because he was rejected. But by what, right? Sometimes it's just, because nobody should be individually responsible for it. But who's gonna be responsible for this mass?
I think that, people sometimes act out of fear, so if you're...
Or hate, maybe.
Well,
envy, right?
I don't really know if there was any hate, but I can imagine that there's sort of pragmatism of, if you're a friend and someone comes to you help, but the government or the neighborhood committee is watching you, and you're going to
that means like neighbor hates you, or neighbor kind of envy your status, right? Because maybe your grandfather used to live a better life than the neighbors, or the common people regard your grandfather as some kind of oppressors, right? They think like we have been oppressed by you and the force behind you.
Well, for sure there was a lot of this extreme thinking during the Cultural Revolution, where whoever they are, whether they're your neighbor, your colleague, your children, started to turn on people who really did nothing wrong. And I think in my grandfather's case, the seminal moment that became an enemy was when, in my mind, the Red Guards found an American flag that was given to him. So that was symbolic of his friendship with the enemy, the United States. And so he immediately came under this suspicion of being a traitor. And from there, then, the Red Guard sort of took over. But I think, there's a lot of circumstances throughout history, even in the United States. I compare a lot of what happened in the early 20th century of China with what is going on in the United States as well as throughout the world in terms of how people's beliefs formulate maybe out of ignorance or misperceptions, and then something happens and innocent people get hurt, whether it be immigrants from the South or Muslims that are trying to make a regular living in the United States, or gays, or whoever it is that get persecuted because of lack of understanding or lack of knowledge, or just not accepting a certain way. And that happens throughout history. And I think that's, it's all history repeating itself decade after decade in different countries and different circumstances. And China got out of hand during the Cultural Revolution for sure.
Yeah. Your book actually started with your Jian Zhen, your grandfather, discuss or reflect on the Boxer movement and the stuff, right? Even Boxer movement, what would you call it? 义和团.
Boxer Rebellion?
Yeah, Boxer Rebellion. Boxer, they mainly targeted Christians, right?
Yes.
The missionary and especially Chinese Christian who were already converted, maybe killed like 30,000, right?
30,000.
Then he himself became one. But I don't know what he was thinking, but you probably, because you dig into it, so do you think he believes this Christianity or churches actually benefit or hurt China? What's this Christianity have done to China in his mind?
Well, his introduction to the church and Christianity was as a kid, as a teenager. So I don't think that he would have these grand concepts of how Christianity fit into Chinese society, but it probably developed over time. Mainly, as I showed in the book, that he was very affected by the plight and the state of ordinary Chinese that were begging in the street, were dying in the street. People were illiterate and taken advantage by Westerners. But then
you think that they are really totally take advantage the result of the Western power,
well,
the poverty and.
Well, I think that was a concept. Remember, at this time during the 19 teens, there was the beginning of this anti-foreignism, which the Christians were sort of a byproduct of these foreign domination of China, and there was a backlash against foreigners and the different powers, particularly after the
xenophobia.
Well, particularly after the Treaty of Versailles, and the May 5th movement, where the Qingdao and Shandong cities were not given back to the Chinese.
Right.
They were given to the Japanese. So a lot of humiliation and sense that our country is dominated by
not powerful enough.
Right. And I think he saw the church being relatively organized, cohesive, connected with the West, taught English, was doing good things. So that was his community. And whenever something bad happened, he congregated all the people in the community together and would escape, into the mountainside or whatever. And so I think that was a natural sanctuary for him and a natural vehicle through which he could see himself helping China and the helping people. I'm not sure if he looked at the nation as sort of a monolithic, government entity, but I think to help the Chinese people.
If the communist China, maybe keep the church running, right? Okay, the other power, those capitalist or the other forces, get out. I don't want to do business with you, but I keep this faith, right? Keep our people, maybe they can have something to look up to, right? Like your grandfather, if he believes Jesus, he's a Jesus follower. He tried to follow what Jesus done to people, right? Just helping people, healing people, and make their life more meaningful for themselves. But seems now, I think the bad consequence gradually shows up because Chinese nowadays, sure, they are much wealthier, but some of them, I say, they feel empty and they feel this never-ending vicious circle is competition or work to death. They don't feel peace, ease.
Well, I think one of the ideas of the book is that China is very complex. It has a complex history with the West, with Christianity, with religions. And you also can't look at Chinese people as a uniform entity.
Yeah, they are not.
They are not. But one of the lessons, perhaps, this is my own theory, is if you look at what happened to the Christian church when it could have been wiped out, right? The Chinese government essentially allowed it to exist under its own rules, right? Because they felt that there was some positive influence it could have. And so it was, in some ways, very pragmatic. What they don't want is to have these organizations to get out of hand and criticize the government. Now, that is not necessarily a solely communist Chinese concept. I mean, it happens here in the United States. You can't run around.
Here, I think we have this free of speech. That's super important because we can clear things up. We can talk about history. Like this book, I don't even think it can be legally published in China, right? That's the irony. Because if we can just talk about what really happened, then we can reason and formulate maybe more reasonable approach to how we can improve our environment. And that helps, right? That greatly helps people to go together and have a better life.
Well, I think your idea of having this debate and being open about certain things that may be unsavory is very important. And that's the only way you'll get at a consensus or understanding. But we also have to understand that China and United States, totally different countries, totally different histories, totally different perspective on what life should be. And I think one of the driving forces, again, this is my own interpretation, is that just like the Chinese government in 1949 wanted the Christians to be a member of their new society, wanted them to be contributing members.
They did.
Yeah, they did, but they obviously don't want them to supersede the government. And it's almost like if you look at the capitalism in China, there's probably no place on earth that's more capitalistic than in China or in Shanghai. There are probably more billionaires in Shanghai than in New York. I don't know that for a fact, but there are a lot of wealthy people.
It's possible.
Right.
Polarized, very polarized, right?
But the idea is that, China allows people to become wealthy. In fact, they want them to become wealthy, but they don't want them to override the government. And they don't. If you get too big for your britches, maybe they're going to tap down on it and tap down on you because they have to control the country. If you look at the United States, 1/4 the population of China, diverse population with many different ideas, and how chaotic our society is now, and how inefficient the government seems to be, not being able to. In California, we can't even get a high-speed railway together. Yeah. So there is some.
It opens another box of worms.
Yeah.
But I speak as an immigrant perspective because I grew up in China, right? I still prefer freedom over among other things.
Right.
And I do believe the energy of this society, this seemingly chaotic, sometimes even uncivil fight, right, in this country, helps to balance out those extremes. And China, on the other hand, it doesn't have that self-correction system. So when it goes on to a little off path, then it will lead to a much greater disaster.
No, well, there's no question that when you have a totalitarian government, the autocratic rule of one entity, yes, you have the risk of going off the deep end, and that hopefully within the United States, when they have this, dual system that and three parts of the government,
right,
that
power
there's the power
balance,
balance that there'll be a check and balance. Now, that has proved to be pretty much true in the big scheme of things. We haven't had an overthrow of the government yet in 200, 300 years, right? But
Because it seems to me like this government is still much smaller than China's. China's central government has way much power. So they can do things efficiently, but at the cost of lots of common people, their benefits or interests are totally ignored.
Right.
So the polarization actually pretty serious over there.
I don't know how people really feel, and I think if you go to different parts of the country, you might get different points of view. I think Chinese people in general are probably less political minded than
Is that a good thing or bad thing? Like
Well,
if our citizen, like fellow California, we don't care election at all. We don't vote, let's say. We don't even vote for local things.
Right.
Then what happened? Then big government take over. I think that when those powerful people can manipulate everything. So in here, what we want actually is more people to be aware of this democratic thing, right? We should engage. We have this civic duty to know things and to supervise things.
Well, I think certainly within a democratic society where each person has a vote and you can bring in people in power, that's a necessary responsibility. As you say, if no one votes, then that system falls apart. By the same token, maybe in an autocratic society like China, which has never seen democracy, it's a different world. And I don't mean to say that they're right or they're wrong, but it's just a different world. You have a more uniform population. I mean, I don't know what the true foreign population is, but it's much different than the United States, where you have this mix of different people from different parts of the world, different religions, different ideas of what life should be like. And we haven't even agreed on, the extent of what freedom of speech really means. So I think you have to look at things and judge things very differently. And from my point of view, in interpreting, I don't know if this is true, and I'm just trying to put myself in the head of the autocratic system there, is that because of their history of so much chaos, and in recent history, it's not 1,000 years ago, it's a few years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, that you've had all this chaos, and you look at what they've been able to build despite that they don't. There's a risk, there's a danger of having too much, not freedom, but too much latitude and too much disagreement. And so, if, for instance, like the COVID thing, Chinese cities are 10 times the size of a lot of American city, much more dense.
But COVID policy in China makes no sense to me, especially in the last year, like 2022, right? The Shanghai lockdown was insane. Like nobody can tolerate that kind of governmental behavior. It's like you lock down people, like 6 million people, 60 million people, right?
I think that was a fear from a medical point of view. Okay, so my take on it is that if you think about the virus and the circulation of virus, and how a virus transmits and how you get immunity or don't have immunity, theoretically, if you have a dense community and you isolate everybody, the virus has no place to go.
That's not true. I think that they finally gave it up, right? They failed. They failed miserably. And they opened it up without any preparation. They just did it so irresponsibly. That's totally political driven stunt. I call it stunt. That's stunning. That's just, how can they lock down people so harshly for such a long time, almost drive all the small business out? Then they don't do anything to like, even just like you said, maybe have enough vaccine like in the United States, right? They didn't do anything. They just feel like, oh, okay, political pressure is too high. Let's just open it up. They open it up in 1 week.
Right.
That's insane for me. That's the really fatal consequence of this totalitarian method of governing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose from a medical point of view, I thought it was.
Do you think that makes sense?
Well, yeah. If you think, no, I think that certainly they were extreme. But if you think about the transmission of virus, if you were able to isolate a population, and I'm not a virologist, but this is my take, and how you have to have person-to-person contact. If you put everybody in a closet.
I don't trust expert on this issue anymore. Like COVID, well, this is how we live, and I'm happy we went through that period of time. Right. For me, I'm pretty much just go out and I do whatever we want, guy. But my relatives in China, right? In the beginning, they were very supportive of the government policy.
Right.
Then they gradually figure out it doesn't make sense anymore. But they suffer too long.
Yeah.
They suffer too long.
Well, I think the
cost is too high.
Yeah, I think that they overshot for sure. I mean, I think we can argue back and forth about how a new virus should be treated or not. I mean, people are still arguing about it. And there were mistakes made on both sides of the ocean, and in many different states, everybody had a different idea of what to do, and I understand the idea of shutdown. My own practice was shut down because of they didn't want us to do elective surgery. So I understand
but here the good thing is we can talk about this. I think those communication, even sometimes heated debate, right? At least we understand each other better. We know what you're concerned about. And I know, okay, you prefer have more outdoors activity. That's because you think that's crucial to your life. We understand that. So we can have some measure in the middle, right? Some people, they are more sensitive, and we have to take care of them too. But at least here, we talk about every day. In China, how can you talk about this? Nobody can even have a real debate about this thing. That's the problem.
Well, I think that's probably true, that if you want a debate or a discussion and to exchange ideas, China is a much more difficult place to do it. Whereas some people in the United States would feel that there's too much freedom. And the fact that, I don't want to... compare too much with the United States and China. But, for instance, the idea of banning ideas, that's happening in the United States.
How? Wow.
Well, people are banning books. People say you can't say certain words.
There's no banning. It's just like from certain systems. They don't like it. You can reject it, but they can still get it in the market. So that's how free market works, right?
Well,
that's not banning at all, because I grew up there. I know what's banning like. Banning is like your book never have any opportunity to be published.
That may be true. I don't know that for a fact. I know they can get it in Hong Kong because they have bought it in Hong Kong. I don't know if they can get it in Beijing. I know it's very difficult and impossible maybe to show a movie, which is what my main goal is. If I were able to make it,
no way.
Right.
That's why I think lots of supply chain even move out. They used to be only like entertainment or cultural related business. They are pretty hard to do business here, right? There. But now more and more industries know, like somehow they will hit the rock bottom. That's why the supply chains moving out, no matter what kind of industries you're in. And this freedom really means something. I mean, freedom matters.
Yeah, sure. Freedom absolutely matters. I think there is a certain degree. I think, to be honest, America has too much freedom. How much you should have. You can't walk around just yelling and screaming and not wearing clothes. So there's always a border or barrier to complete
freedom.
freedom.
That's disrespect. So freedom what we call freedom in Christianity is like wherever the Lord is, the freedom follows, right? So that means what Jesus teach or taught, or the principle of this ancient wisdom or the God-given thing actually do deliver freedom, truth. Like Jesus said, I am the path, the way and the life, right? The way, life, and truth. I think these all things matters because truth matters. We have to speak our mind, and at least we don't lie, right? Because lies kills. That's how communist kills. Nowadays, still people cannot understand our history. That's really hurting, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you just try to do the things that forget about Jesus and religion because people believe different things, but listen to what your parents tell you. Tell the truth. Apologize, obey your elders, certain principles of how you act in life. And those are pretty good principles to live by. And certainly telling the truth is an important...
And to pursue the truth too. Like
Jian Zhen, seek the truth.
Yeah, like your name, like Yuan. What's our hope? To be honest, if we all die, then where the hope is, right? There has to be some eternal things to look up to suck on to, right? So that's the hope. If we just hoping like we just fictionize our ancestors, that's how can we have hope? I mean, and what exactly your grandfather's hope will be to?
So when we talk sort of spiritually as a Christian, I don't know if his view or hope for him was to go to heaven and be with God and all that, but he sort of symbolically imbued his children with hope. So Zhuang, and maybe there is that practical concept of the hope is with the future, with your descendants, and hope that they make they do good things and whatever that
you're
is.
Doing
right?
good. You're doing good in United States. Your mother was doing good in United States, but your grandfather did die in Cultural Revolution. That's what happened.
Yeah, I don't know what the point is. I mean, he could have died with the Japanese. He could have died, doing his trek through the mountain, trying to get back to. There are many times that anyone could die.
Because my family has not exactly a bishop, right? But my grandmother was a teacher, and he's a pretty noble teacher.
Right.
He got persecuted, and his sons, my father, my uncles, they got persecuted too. Their childhood, their youth, their growth, their career were hugely impacted.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, one thing in the book, I don't know if this relates completely, but I tried to write the book not from a one political point of view or from a Christian point of view. I looked at it mainly from a historical point of view, and the idea is that if you look at what happened in China, everybody was a victim of somebody else. The communists were killing the Kuomintang was killing peasants, the peasants were killing landlords. Everybody, I mean, there's so much people in conflict. The Japanese were killing
because of the lacking of truth, I think.
Well, I mean, if you even look at the geopolitics, that the United States and Japanese were fighting the North Koreans and China, and then in the Lambeth conference, the Japanese were invited by the British to go to London, and the Americans were sitting on the same side as the Japanese and the Chinese. With my grandfather leading one of the bishops going to the conference, were communicating with the Japanese, who they were at war with 3 years previous to that. So the point is that, in some ways, there's no universal, absolute right and wrong, that you have to learn how to
I
get along
disagree with that.
Well, that your enemy could be your friend, and your friend could be your enemy. And
that's from a totally pragmatic point of view, right? If you say so, then the world is basically a jungle. So there's no right and wrong. So whoever has more power can just control the things and can conquer the things. And then what hope we have? Then we only the only hope is like we become more powerful and more powerful, self-serving and self-serving. That's the hope. But I don't think that's the hope at all.
The hope, I guess, is in that maybe in the Word. Okay, the first chapter. If you don't remember, the first chapter is called The Word.
Yeah, it's a capital W. The Word.
The Word.
The Word means like God's word.
No,
or what?
no.
Yeah,
So
usually we Christians regard it, the Word means like that's
what's
God
important.
Himself.
Yeah, right. No, the word here was when my grandmother whispered a word. No, my grandfather whispered a word to his wife, my grandmother, while he was being driven to the hospital for the last time. So he whispers this word. Okay.
I couldn't find it yet. Just tell me.
It's at the last chapter, last paragraph, I think.
The chapter 1 in the end, right?
Right.
He settled back into her arms, let his head sink into her lap.
Just before that, probably the paragraph before that.
Okay, the bishop knew he would never see it, but he held faith deep in his heart, which has endured so much. He strained to lift his head, and they pulled Constance closer. His lips nearly touched her ear. He drew a deep breath and whispered one word, without anger, without hate, with complete conviction. It was a most Christian word, a simple word. It didn't mention the word.
Right. You have to read the entire book to find out what the word is.
Grace? Or
no?
What?
The word is forgive.
Forgive.
Okay, that's a very Christian word. To forgive is like Jesus forgave Barabbas, right? I mean, and the other criminal on the side on the
cross.
The cross, right?
The premise is like that thief has to believe in him, right? Because he said, "Oh, I believe you, and you are a good man." Then Jesus said, "Okay, today you will be with me in the paradise." That's what happened. But the other side, that guy didn't say anything. See, so he's not forgive. So forgiving have some condition. It's like a reconciliation needs some truth, right? Truth first, like we have to get an agreement of what's true. Then we can talk about, if you did wrong, I forgive you.
But if you just forget about the circumstances or what you're forgiving. If someone says, I forgive.
About what?
Anything. So the idea is that when you say, I forgive, it's like, to me, if you think of symphony or music, and you play and you play and play, and at the final, you have this chord, that you feel relief, that there's a resolution, that there's a calmness and end to all this contrapoint and dissonance that went on before, that you have this final chord and you feel it's over and things are resolved, right? The resolution. And so this idea, the British could forgive the Japanese, the Americans can forgive the Japanese can forgive the Chinese. If you talk to people nowadays, the Vietnamese can forgive the Americans. So that's
a beautiful thing. And you put it beautifully. I think use that symphony as a metaphor is really, really great. But I mean, we surely should forgive people, but we should not forgive what's wrong. Like we are talking about, it's like even in Christian concept, right? Sins. It's like you are not totally fall into this right thing. So that's we don't forgive that. We don't even let it just be. We need to try to get rid of it, or at least admit it's not right.
Well, the saying is you can forgive but don't forget, right? So that you obviously want to learn and discuss and figure out what went wrong or what decision you made or what the bad things were that made you have to forgive or may put you in this situation of needing to forgive somebody. So you can forgive but not forget. And in some ways, that's one of the themes of the book. I mean, there are many, I think, complex themes in the book, but one of them is that the world, with all this chaos, at some point you have to forgive someone, or else you'll never resolve. Your symphony will go on forever. But the reason to write the book is so that you don't forget, that people who don't know this history will understand, what did the bishop go through? What did my mother go through? What did the missionaries go through? What did the Chinese go through? And whatever happened. It's not like I can change it, but you have to be aware of it so you can sit here in 21st century 2023 and understand, the deeper complexities of China.
I agree with that.
And I think I don't know your take on it, but certainly my take over the last few years, when I hear people discuss China or criticize China or whatever China, they don't understand China. That most Americans, the average American, have no idea.
They certainly don't. Certainly
and this
don't.
book was,
but I somehow do.
Yes. Okay. So this book, to get back at the writing, the reason why I wrote this book, in part, was to educate non-Chinese. So it's written mainly for the non-Chinese audience. It's written like a thriller, short chapters, give them a sort of Western view of a Chinese point of view. And so I think a lot of Chinese already know certain stories, but the average American don't.
They don't.
And they're stuck in the 1950s with the Red Scare and McCarthyism. And I think that just doesn't do anyone any good.
Right. I agree with that.
And so that's the point in writing the book. And I hope that non-Chinese, they may think, oh, this is a book about China, it's a book about Christianity, I'm not interested. But those are the people that need to read the book. It's those who don't understand where the Chinese government or the Chinese people are coming from, that the China didn't drop into 21st century as a superpower with all this wealth. They had to go through a lot of, trials and tribulations. And
I agree. I think you did great. I think always it's better to have somebody like you to make this a great effort, actually, to put into history into perspective and communicate our past, collective past, right? The history. But I talk to you mainly from a more personal level. It's like first of all, we are all person, right? We are human beings. So I just want to understand how exactly we should live a life. Sometimes how we can see things clearly. That's my take. So if anything I said make you think offensive or please forgive me.
No. I think for instance. Because I talked to my kids like this when they were trying to decide which college to go to, which careers. I said, it doesn't really matter. If you look at the world, there are people in the world making a certain life in different circumstances. You don't have to go to college. You don't have to be a doctor. You don't have to do anything, but you need to make something out of yourself, be productive, be happy, move forward, help other people, just sort of these general concepts. But whether you're rich or poor or drive a certain car, it doesn't really matter. It is no standard. You could talk to a Christian or talk to someone who's Jewish or Confucian or Muslim, and everybody has a different way of looking at things, and you all have to coexist. In some ways, sometimes it's with the political discourse, it's like a Muslim trying to convince a Christian that he's ignorant of his religion. It's just a belief system, and so you believe certain things. So that's why I say there's, that it's all this chaos and there's no right or wrong, even though you may look at it from a, maybe even a fundamentalist point of view. Another person who, is Chinese communist will look at the United States in a certain point of view. They think they're right. If you go to Cuba or from Croatia or Russia, everybody's got a different take. And I think we sort of have to accept other people's point of view and to see how we can do good things.
We try
right?
to understand, at least take a glimpse of other people's point of view, right? So we can learn things, right? To even recheck our own belief system. But what exactly really motivates you to make this great effort, right? Something has to be transcend about your daily life. I mean.
Yeah, so originally I said I wanted to make this movie. I just saw this grand epic movie.
Have you made any movie before?
No, but I've written screenplays. I did that as a hobby 40 years ago, and so I actually wrote a screenplay called Red Bishop in 2016. And after showing it around people in Hollywood, nobody knew what to do with it because it would be a very difficult movie to make.
Yeah, especially making here. Right? That's going to be really expensive.
And not only expensive, but a movie that Hollywood wants to bring to China but will be censored.
Where's that market?
Yeah, a movie that has a Chinese as the lead protagonist hero.
Yeah,
How many movies do you see that are like that? So to me, the movie, even though I could see it like a Dr. Zhivago or Lawrence of Arabia, sort of grand scheme with grand epic with cast of thousands that I grew up with, I thought it'd be a very impactful, dramatic film with a lot of seminal emotional moments in it. So I thought it was a good idea. But when I showed it around to people I knew in Hollywood, they all said, well, you have to write a book. And so the book actually came almost directly from the screenplay. So if you read the book, you can almost see the movie in front of you. But the main motivation, one, started out trying to understand my grandfather and my family history and how I ended up where I ended up from this mission, from this Christian background in China 150 years ago. And then as I started to research and pull the story together, I realized that telling my story means telling the story of my grandfather, which means telling the story of the church, which means telling the story of China. So it became a bigger a story than just my family. It became a story of China. And then as I was finishing it during the pandemic, because I had a lot of time, my practice was shut down, I realized that, this was even more important because people in America didn't really understand China. They had no concept of what was going on.
Did you get any hate or attack during this recent years? Because I do see you have this kind of stop Asian hate maybe ideas behind this.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, all of that came into play. Not only the politics of how people perceive China, but also how regular citizens and the government may have been treating Chinese citizens. So, yeah, you wanted to sort of rectify that, or at least shine a light on certain truths that
again, truth. You mentioned the truth.
I mean, not all,
I support that word.
Yeah, I mean, not all Chinese eat dogs. Everybody. You'd hear things that the Chinese people eat dogs, and it's like, that type of thing.
Stereotyping. Yeah, sure. There's lots of stupid people here. That's for sure, right? Yeah. But I think this again, the free speech matters. Yeah. We can laughing at them, right? Freely, right? If we feel like somebody really talks somebody they really don't know and they making this stupid stereotyping stuff, we can make a joke about them, right? That's I think, a very powerful tool. Like, just talk.
Right.
Right.
Well, hopefully, and sometimes I think, this is really not helping because the reason why I wanted to make a movie was that I thought movies would be more impactful. People go to movies, it lasts longer. A lot of people don't read books anymore.
I know.
And you think about
people don't even watch movie anymore. They watch TV series more.
Yeah. So if you think about, you want this high-minded, enlightenment of people, and are they going to read the book, a 400-page book? Well, a lot of those people who are stuck in the 1950s, they're not even going to read the book. So it's like preaching in the desert.
I know. But story, I'm really a story reader. I personally make documentaries, right? I watch lots of movies. But to me, I think most people watching movie, not watching like a collective memory or a grandiose story. They have to read a personal thing. They have to emphasize the characters. They have to put their shoes into the shoes of the characters so they can make moral choices when they watch the movie, right? That's how we feel like it's so engaging. It's so it's powerful. It's attractive. So again, I do believe you have lots of very personal things poured into this work. And hopefully people can read it out and get something.
Yes, I may hope individually, an individual reader can read this, understand more about China and its people and how it relates to today's world. Be more empathetic maybe to immigrants, because my parents were immigrants, and I think they've done quite a bit for people they came in contact with. So, but I also would hope that there's a producer or director out there that can see a bigger picture and can bring this to the masses, in terms of a impactful film. So.
Yeah, I do think this probably needs the film from our own community. Because like you said, at least part of the film has to be from us to support this kind of project. It does take lots of resources. Like think about the locations. How can you get there?
Well, I actually went to China and I talked to some movie people there.
Oh, really? Which companies?
The Shanghai Media. Shanghai
文广集团, right?
I don't know the Chinese, but they run all the TV and radio. And
I know.
So I talked to the I think it was the president, and he said, he first said, I didn't have the book. I just explained the story, and he said, there's a red line. You can't cross the red line. But we can make the movie for you, but you can't show it here. So
that's good. I mean, right? And you have to get some like stars in China, because audience go to the theater to see celebrities.
Yeah, but the
and you cannot have Chinese American to play this. Like they cannot even speak the language.
Yeah, my original thought, when I conceptualized the actual movie, was to get an unknown Chinese actor to play my grandfather, because I didn't want people to identify a certain actor with him. I just wanted him to stand on his own as an own character.
That's hard.
But I wanted the supporting characters to be well-known actors, so that whoever I can name names, but well-known people playing these minor roles with him as a central character that nobody could identify. You don't want to have so Robert De Niro play your star, because everybody sees Robert De Niro, right?
Actually, real good actors can do that magic. It's thinking about Daniel Day-Lewis, right?
Yeah.
He played Lincoln. Come on, man. And people still convinced somehow. They feel like, this is great.
Yeah. I suppose that's true. But my concept was, sort of have a relatively unknown and have the character stand on its own. Have these cast of minor supporting characters played by known people that could draw in an audience.
I understand that.
And then have a international consortium of producers from England, from the United States, from Australia, from China, because I wanted this film to be sort of a coming together, because it's an international film.
They have missionary characters, right?
And it's set in England, it's set in the United States,
right.
so and just the concept of bringing people together to have a common focus and have different production houses working together to produce this film, I thought would be a great metaphor in some respect. And then have a great director. I actually approached An Lee, someone of his
really?
of his stature, but my thought has evolved from a big screen epic film to perhaps a streaming limited series, because the story is so long and complex that if you have 8 or 10 or 12 episodes, and if I could get someone like Spielberg to executive produce it,
wow,
and
you're
then,
ambitious, man.
yeah, well, and then have a lot of well-known directors direct each episode, so to have,
that's how they did like House of Cards and those very famous.
Right, exactly, that type of thing.
Wow, you're ambitious, right?
Well, this movie lends itself to that sort of grand scheme, I think, and it could be very impactful because it is the themes are relevant to today, or at least you can talk about it. And I think it's kind of the time for Asian themes and Asian actors and Asian directors. I mean, look at on the Academy Awards this year. So I think this idea that these sort of Asian or Chinese movies are relegated into the second tier is maybe not viable anymore, and maybe these could be top level films.
That's good. Yeah, if you have lots of Asian Americans to direct the series, it would be a really great presentation, even representation of our people here.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if your audience knows anyone, tell them to get a hold of me. But that's sort of my goal with the book. I really didn't care if it became a bestseller or that thousands of people would read it. Of course, I'd like that, but if I could get something put in a cinematic and adaptation, I think that would be better.
I do think your book, thinking about the spanning of the time, is maybe more suitable for a TV series to be produced.
Right.
And that can tell the depth and the wholeness of the thing.
Right. And if I spent a lot of time, like we all did during the pandemic, watching these limited series and from other countries, the Turkish films and Korean. And I realized that there was such a big production value in a lot of these series. I said, how can they do this for $10 million? It looks like a $50 million film,
Yeah.
And so maybe there is hope to have this grand movie put on the small screen.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Okay, good.
Yeah. All right, so thank you so much, Mr. Yuan, and I'm thrilled to have you here and listening to your great opinion and family history.
I really appreciate this dialogue and having you given me the opportunity to talk about my book.
Yeah. Next time you come to Bay Area, I'm still gonna invite you here for the updates. Okay. I'm hoping this can be made into TV series.
Great.
Right.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.